Great to have such an energized and energetic group of alumni, faculty, staff, students, and friends here with us for this weekend, celebrating our 150th. This afternoon's program kicks off with a panel with several distinguished Dartmouth and Thayer alumni and a member of the Thayer faculty. We're going to continue thematically some of the conversations we've been having for the past day or so. This one, a panel discussion on succeeding in entrepreneurship, engineering, and Dartmouth as a partnership to help our students explore an entrepreneurial pathway. I'm not going to introduce the panelists. In a moment, I'll pause and ask them to introduce themselves briefly and tell you about their connection to the entrepreneurial environment. But first, let me say that this is a panel we were excited to assemble because of what it represents regarding the focus and emphasis of Dartmouth under Phil Hanlon's presidency and of the Thayer School of Engineering. As I said this morning, we have reached the point where 1 in 3 of our faculty members are technology entrepreneurs, having started a business based on their work in the past 17 years now. I am convinced, and you can quote me on this as long as you say the dean believes, that is the highest level per capita of any engineering school in the country. Our students come to us with a passion for using technology to change the world, and entrepreneurship, being entrepreneurial innovators, is of course an important part of that. But when we interact with our students, we're not talking to them about the opportunity to make millions or billions when they enter the door and think about being entrepreneurs. Although, just to be clear, for the record, we have no objection if they actually are ultimately that successful. It's really about exploring their creative interests and, as I said this morning, finding a way to use technology to impact the greater good in the most direct possible way. So with that, let me stop. I'm going to turn to our panelists, starting with Scott Sandell, a member of our Board of Overseers on my far left. Ask them to make just a minute or two of opening comments about their background and connection to the entrepreneurial space as an investor or an entrepreneur, and then we'll start with some questions. In about 30 to 35 minutes, I'll stop asking the panel questions and turn to the group of you for open discussion. So with that, Scott, why don't you get us started?
Thanks, Joe. Well, first off, I'm a member of the great class of 1986, and if you haven't noticed, we're extremely well represented up there in that row there. I was an AB graduate, so I didn't go on to get the BE. It became clear to me that I wanted to be an innovator in the business world rather than invent a new technology, although I love the program here, and it's served me incredibly well doing what I do as a venture capitalist, where I invest in next-generation innovations that are often very technical in nature, and Thayer has served me really well at being able to understand those enough to collaborate with world-class scientists and engineers to build transformative companies that are making a difference. I've been at NEA, which is the largest venture capital firm in the United States. We have about $17 billion under management, about 450 companies globally. About 80% of our capital is in the U.S., about 20% is overseas. Just last week, I became the managing partner. I've been the co-managing partner for a few years with my predecessor, Peter Barris, and I'm based in Menlo Park, California.
Great.
Thank you, Scott. Sherri?
So I'm Sherri Oberg. I'm class of 82 from Dartmouth and 86 from Tuck. Yay. And I was a history major in an MBA, not an engineer, but I joined right after Tuck. I got into the venture capital world right at the time when biotech was getting started and people were engineering DNA for the first time. And I spent about 5 years in venture capital, and then I left venture capital to go run one of the companies that I had invested in, which had all kinds of promise and potential when we invested, and went through a big struggle where we thought we were going to lose everything. And I jumped into it thinking, I got my partners into this mess, I better do something. And turned it around and had a really exciting time, and decided that as much as I liked venture capital, I loved being an entrepreneur. And so I started a company with Bob Langer at MIT, who was the scientific founder of the previous company. He and I got along really well, and went through a 20-year journey of starting a company around a chemical engineering technology that Bob had initiated at MIT. And after 20 years, we went through the idea creation, reducing a drug in the cardiovascular space to animals, clinical trials, the whole kit and caboodle, did an IPO, grew the company to about 150 people. It was really just a fun, interesting adventure. And then after 20 years, decided that was a nice round number, time to do something different, and pursued some other creative interests during a sabbatical, working on a documentary about the need to change education that premiered at Sundance Film Festival. And now I'm back here living in the Upper Valley. My family just moved up here, and I'm working with a venture capital firm here locally called Borealis Ventures. And in parallel with that, I'm working again with Bob Langer and Bill Gates on a technology for addressing malnutrition in third world countries. So lots of topics that hopefully will find some common interests.
Right. Thank you, Sherri. Andrea.
I'm Andrea Marron. I graduated from University of Rochester undergrad with a degree in optical engineering, spent a couple years in the engineering world, and then came to Thayer for the MEM program. I graduated in 2012, and most recently I've started a software company that's a data company in the retail space, and we've been working on it for about 2.5 years now, so still in the very early stages.
Can you, before we turn to Karl, Andrea, could you say just a sentence or two about the focus of the company?
Sure. So we're in market intelligence. So the fashion industry and apparel industry is going through a lot of turmoil right now, where fashion companies are closing stores and going bankrupt. And part of that is because of a shift in consumer behavior, where consumers now have access to price transparency and a lot of options on the internet. And so we're giving fashion companies the power to use data to inform their pricing and merchandising decisions.
Karl.
My name's Karl Griswold. I'm a faculty member here at the Thayer School, and I might just start off by saying, as Joe mentioned, you can't swing a Series A financing agreement around here without hitting a professor that has a startup company. So it's a real pleasure and honor to have been invited to join these esteemed entrepreneurs. I'm much earlier in the entrepreneurial game. I think we're just kind of getting started in that. But kind of my tie to entrepreneurship is really driven by my research interests here at Thayer. So we're interested in biotechnology and how biotech is reshaping and will continue to reshape modern medicine. And in particular, we're interested in what we call protein engineering. And so basically developing high-performance biomolecules that can treat human disease. So that's kind of what the research interests are here at Thayer. Obviously, there's kind of a very direct path or potential path towards commercialization and clinical translation based on our research interests. And we've been fortunate enough that we've been able to start a couple of companies now. So I have a small biotech service company that's been operating since 2013 called Stealth Biologics. We primarily work with biopharma partners. And then we just recently started a company called Liticon that's focused on developing biotech solutions to the antibiotic drug resistance crisis.
Thank you all. So first, let me just ask you to please join me in welcoming our distinguished panelists. Thank you. So I want to start by just continuing to build on some remarks I made this morning about the importance of federal funding, at least for academics, and thinking about going down an entrepreneurial pathway. I think of federal funding as the seed corn that helps ideas nurture and develop, helps fund the fundamental underlying science. So I want to first start with you, Karl, and then I'm going to turn to you, Sherri, and just ask honestly and openly, has federal funding been important in the development of your idea? Did that play a role in helping you consider an entrepreneurial pathway? Karl, how about you?
Yeah, absolutely. So the companies that we've started, and I think, the products that I hope will transition into the clinic and in the market in the future, they would not happen without federal funding. So the nucleation of all of these ideas thus far has been here at Thayer, and then we've taken the technologies that have been successful and advanced sufficiently far from here at Thayer into the marketplace. So I think it's critical. I would say, and I know that this wasn't implied in your question, but I think it's worth emphasizing that not all federal grants need to be commercialized to be successful. I think there's a much bigger mission in federal funding than just starting new ventures. I also think that in many cases, federal grants can lead to commercial ideas in unanticipated ways. Mm-hmm. So I think that's very important. But certainly I think for people like myself that are interested in entrepreneurship, kind of pursuing federal grants with a purpose and kind of with that long-term vision in mind is incredibly enabling.
Right. Thank you. That's great. And it's an important point to emphasize. Really, the role the federal government plays is to fund exploration of the underlying science and technology development. And it is not driving any of us as faculty members to building a specific device that is commercializable. We've got an interesting system in this country that's evolved to give you the flexibility to do this right? Would you agree?
Absolutely.
But there's absolutely no pressure from NIH, NSF, or anyone to go down that path. So, Sherri, how about you? In the early stages of Acusphere, had federal funding played a role, or was this completely privately financed? I'm sure Bob Langer's lab gets a little bit of money.
Right. Well,
from the federal government.
by the time from the company creation time on, it was all privately funded. But before the company was created, there was a huge basis of knowledge that was created through federal funding that led to the technology that we licensed from MIT to get things started. And there's no way that private money would have funded the long timelines with the uncertain direction that those grant monies were funding. But without that foundation, we would never have been able to do what we did. So it turned out to be incredibly important for Acusphere, and I think it's just true across pretty much every area of science. I'm reading a really great book right now called The Emperor of All Maladies about the history of cancer research. And I think that book, but if anybody's interested in cancer, it's a fascinating story. And the incredible leaps that we have taken in cancer treatments over the last 15 years have been a result of decades of government grants and federal funding, understanding the molecular biology behind what's happening in cancer, and that's leading to targeted therapies that aren't toxic, and it's just amazing. So yes, super important.
Thank you. Now, Scott, does the presence or absence of federal funding make any difference as you evaluate an investment decision?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, I think we recognize that we benefit from the funding that has created the foundations that we get to then fund. And I think in general, the venture capital industry and the entrepreneurial ecosystem are incredibly at a very, very healthy state today because of a tremendous amount of federal funding that has been going on for decades. I mean, we, to your point, Sherri, as venture capitalists, we don't fund research. It's just not what we do.
Yes, although if you changed your mind, the faculty of the world wouldn't object. But I think that's pretty well understood.
Yeah, no, we fund development and onward, if you think about it that way.
Thank you. So let's talk now a little bit about, for the scientist and the engineer, the intersection between thinking about discovery-based research, thinking about potential commercial application, and then starting to get a sense of the business tools, skills, expertise, and partnerships that are needed. And Andrea, here I want to start with you because you came to us as a student with an interesting background. If I'm remembering way back from your application to the MEM program correctly, you had, either as an undergraduate or shortly after graduating from Rochester, started a business on the side. You pursued some entrepreneurial ideas when you were here as a student. And so you were being very intentional about intersecting engineering and business. But tell me how you came to identify business skills that might have been missing from your engineering education and how you built that either through education or through making mistakes as an entrepreneur?
So I think one thing that really attracted me to the Dartmouth community and Thayer as opposed to other graduate school programs that I was looking at the time was the sense of community at Dartmouth and at Thayer. I had gone to some other programs where I sort of felt like I would be a number, and here the sense of community was really clear to me as soon as I started to meet some of the faculty members, and they had already looked at my application and my background and knew who I was, and I think that's really important in entrepreneurship, which is something that I thought a lot about in picking a program. Was I wanted to find a place where I could build a network, because I didn't really have a network to start a company, and a network of smart people is so important. So I would say that coming to Thayer was really important in doing.
So thank you. So did you pick up some of the, let's think about your first entrepreneurial venture. Remind me, were you a student or was it after you graduated and before you came to the MEM program?
Yeah, I was a student at University of Rochester studying engineering, and I really wanted to get some business experience. And so I started a company because I thought that would be the best way to get hands-on experience.
And was it?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, there's really no better experience in entrepreneurship than starting a company. I think there's a question of like whether you could teach entrepreneurship and teach that mindset, and I think it in my opinion, it's something that is pretty tough to teach. You just have to jump in and do it.
Right. Although there is, of course, still a role for colleges and universities to play.
I mean, of course, I think it's around building an ecosystem and a community to support entrepreneurs.
Right. Thank you. So, Scott, let me turn to you building on that and just ask, when you're thinking about an investment that's being brought forward not by a seasoned entrepreneur, but by a technologist, an engineer, or a scientist who might be a first-time entrepreneur, what do you look for and what do you worry about?
Well, first of all, we really like first-time CEOs and founder CEOs because as you build a company, you try to add missing ingredients, but you can never replace a founder. The founder has this sense of ownership, this inspiration, creativity, and vision for a company that is just truly irreplaceable. So what we try to do is coach our founders to build the team around themselves that complements what they bring to the table. I think the first thing that we try to determine, Joe, is whether the founder is really determined to be the CEO of the company. Mm-hmm. And if they've never been a CEO and they're very determined to be the CEO, we look for, obviously, whether they have a sense of their own abilities and what they might be lacking, whether they're coachable. And if we find those things, and it's even more helpful if they appreciate that there is a chance they might not be the best person to lead their company always and forever, and would be open to changes down the road if they're warranted, then we're usually comfortable going forward. What tends to push us away is when I loved what Jeff Immelt said earlier when he was asked this question about being old, and he said, well, the 25-year-old who thinks they know everything in my book is old. Mm-hmm. And so, we obviously share that belief that age is not really a function, is not a biological thing. It's a function of attitude, and we look for people who are trying to grow and want to learn from others and are open to coaching and suggestions. And then, if we go that next step, we sit down with them and we talk to them about hiring, what kinds of people we'd like them to hire, and help them hire people who are tremendously more experienced than they are in each of the functional disciplines that they're going to need to build their company. That gives them the best chance of success, and it gives the company the best chance of success, because if they turn out not to be the right leader forever, oftentimes that leader is already on the team.
Right. So Sherri, let me put the same question to you. Particularly, you have an interesting perspective since you've lived on both sides of this. You're an investor, and you've also been the leader of a nascent biotechnology company. And so what's your reaction when you encounter potentially a first-time CEO, specifically someone who's got an engineering or scientific background? Who is, of course, smarter than everyone else in the room at that particular moment in time.
When I was listening to Scott, it was resonating with me because I learned the same thing when I was, as I mentioned, I was in venture capital right out of business school, and time again, I would see, it was a great place for me to learn how to be a CEO because I could see people doing things really well and try to copy what they did and then learn from their mistakes. And one of the things I learned was that the really great leaders had this weird combination of the confidence to lead, but the humility to know that they didn't know everything. And so when I was starting, now for me, in my situation, it was pretty easy to have humility because I was a history major with an MBA starting a biotech company and I had no management experience. So I knew I needed some help. And so the first thing I did, and that really played well for me, was to to figure out what I didn't know that was important to know, and find the people that knew it and get them to work with me. And no company it gets started by one person. And I agree, the founder is incredibly important driving force. But the founder, no matter how visionary, no matter how passionate, no matter how talented they are, they can't do it by themselves. It's a team effort. And so knowing, figuring out what you don't know and surrounding yourself by that talent base is really important.
Right. Now, Karl, let me turn to you with a similar question. So I remember interviewing you for a faculty position not so many years ago, and I don't think at that moment in time you were seeing yourself as a potential entrepreneur. Maybe I'm wrong, so tell me, am I right or wrong? And when did you start? And of course, the dean's always right, but tell me if I'm right or wrong. No, he's tenured now. He can say whatever he wants. So, and when that transition started to happen and what it was that triggered that different way of thinking.
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right. When I was interviewing for faculty positions, I had a great appreciation for the challenge that I was facing and how difficult it might be to establish yourself as an independent PI in a research lab and also teach classes. And so I was really focused kind of on that mission. But I think that even at that time, I still very much had a desire and an interest and a passion for entrepreneurship. It was maybe, second fiddle to my focus on being successful academically at first. But entrepreneurship was actually a big part of what brought me to Thayer as opposed to other institutions, is that there was just a multitude of colleagues here that had kind of blazed this path between academic research ventures and translating them into the market and into the clinic. And that was incredibly inspiring for me and also encouraging. And I was hopeful that I might be able to kind of follow in their footsteps eventually.
Right. So it's interesting. And so it's something you sensed in the environment and maybe not front of mind, but certainly it wasn't an alien thought to you, even when you started here as an assistant professor.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Thank you. So one of the things I'd like to ask each of you to reflect on is just in your journey down these entrepreneurial pathways, what's been the most surprising thing that you've discovered about yourself in exploring an entrepreneurial opportunity? So yes, it was not on the list of questions we shared before, so right. So Scott, I'm going to start with you. You've got a lot of experience as a venture capitalist. What did you learn about yourself that you didn't anticipate going down this pathway?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is that I'm dyslexic, and I didn't know that till I was 42 years old. So when my daughter was going into second grade, one of my daughters, who turns out to be a copycat, at least from a brain architecture standpoint of me, we discovered that she was dyslexic, and in turn, that led to me discovering that I was dyslexic. Now, people who are about 5 years younger than I am would have been tested, and pervasively that would have been discovered. But it was certainly somewhat surprising to me. And then it sort of made a lot of things make sense. And so when I was an engineer here, I could always figure out how to solve the problems, but getting the answer right to 2 decimal places was hard. Reading my own handwriting and not making mistakes because of my handwriting was hard. Doing things in the required time limit was hard. And so, what I've come to appreciate, and I had some appreciation of before that, but certainly since, is how the dyslexic brain architecture, for those of you who don't know about it, we all know the limitations of the dyslexic brain, but there are quite a lot of advantages too that are starting to be well understood. If you're interested in the subject, pick up the book, The Dyslexic Advantage, which documents the most current research on this topic. And I mention it because it's a real passion of mine. About 40% of entrepreneurs are dyslexic, it turns out. They're
40.
40. It's a continuum, of course, but 40%. Dyslexics are about 10% of the population, and they're not only massively overrepresented in the prison population, but as entrepreneurs. Why is that? It's because the educational system is not designed to serve them well, and yet they have a lot to offer. So I would encourage all of us who are part of the educational community here to be mindful of what it takes to help people who are not just dyslexic, but who have different intellectual profiles and gifts to navigate through our system and come out intact and able to thrive in our society.
Yeah, that's a really important point, Scott. Thank you. And it's something that we as educators try and keep in mind, certainly here at Thayer. There are many different styles of learning, many different approaches. And when you say what makes a great engineer, it's many different things, and they might be completely different sets of skills and approaches in two different individuals. And trying to have an educational system and approach that supports that is both challenging but appropriate, and something that really needs to be brought out more fully. Sherri, how about you?
So before I give my answer, I'll just riff off Scott a little bit, because not only is it really important, what he said really important, but it's really important to the entrepreneurial process to have a lot of diversity. And when I'm talking about diversity, I mean it in the broadest sense, intellectual diversity, different types of people. And it was one of the hardest things I had to learn as an entrepreneur, was how to work with people that were, in college you kind of hang out with the people that are like yourself and your friends and all that stuff. But when you get into business, what I said earlier is I was surrounding myself with people who knew what I didn't know. Well, those people were pretty different from me. And at first, it was a big challenge, but then when I started just kind of rolling with it, I realized, this is really some pretty creative stuff is coming out of this ragtag group of people that are pretty different. So there's a lot of reasons to think about what Scott's saying. For me personally, what was the most surprising was how long I stayed as CEO. I remember when I raised the first round of venture capital, having this moment of anxiety, saying, "Oh my God, I did it! Now what if I don't want to do this forever?" And then I thought, no problem. I've been in venture capital. I know what happens to the founders. They usually get shuffled off. Either the company's going to fail, or the CEO, the company's going to do well, and they'll fire me and hire somebody with a lot of experience. So I won't be doing this forever. So that helped me get over my moment of anxiety. But what happened was I learned about myself that I'm what I call a learning animal. I love to learn new things. And when you're going through the process of creating a company, you hit a milestone, and then it's a whole new series of things that you need to learn to do next. And that kept it so fun and interesting for me that I kept staying, and I was having so much fun, and we were building this great team that somehow they let me stay. So it was that was probably the most surprising thing.
Thank you. Andrea, how about you?
Sure. So I would say one of the things that I didn't expect when we started our company was how hard it was going to be. I knew entrepreneurship was going to be hard, but I didn't really understand all of the challenges and barriers that we would come up against. And so I think if I knew then all of the challenges that we would face, I would have thought that I would have given up at some point. But so I guess I've surprised myself in my ability to persevere in a lot of challenging situations and through a lot of maybe more downs than ups. And I think that's something that you have to find within yourself as an entrepreneur, and that like every human being has a well of ability to persevere that you might not even realize you have.
And Karl, you're newest to this. I was going to call it a game. You're newest to this pursuit. But there must be things you didn't recognize about yourself that you found as you've gone down this path.
Yeah, so it is, well, I think it's true for everybody that it's kind of an ongoing active learning process, but I'm certainly, I think, on the steep part of the learning curve right now. I think maybe one of the things that I've had to come to terms with just deals with the way that I approach things. So I have a habit of being really meticulous and really meticulous in things that I do. So, for example, the very first oral presentation, podium presentation that I gave at a national engineering conference when I was in graduate school, I started practicing that talk. I had the slides done and practiced that talk starting about a month in advance. And my guess is I did the talk 1,000 times before I actually got up in front of people. And so it turns out that when you're a professor and trying to start businesses and teaching classes and running a research group and writing papers and writing grants, you can't practice talks 1,000 times before you give them. And so I think one of the things that I've had to come to terms with is that you can do things really well and maybe close to perfect in your own judgment without being excessive in the lead up to it. And I think that's something that I'm learning as I go along and kind of in terms of just balancing time.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask one last question, actually two separate questions. The first one I'm going to put to Sherri and then Scott. The second one I'm going to put to Andrea and then Karl, and then we'll open it up for general discussion. So the question for Sherri first and then Scott is, from your perspective, where you sit today. Right, the investment industry has been undergoing some fairly significant change the past several years, but these are very interesting times in terms of intellectual property protection, federal funding of work at universities, certainly, and then the whole startup environment for companies, particularly in technology-related space, in medical devices, medical products, and in energy. What major changes do you see on the horizon for the industry from where you sit today? Sherri, how about you first?
Well, I'll start with, I think, what's going to be the same. It's like there's always these really entrepreneurial people who figure out that no matter what changes are happening, the opportunities that are getting created by those changes. So I, even though there's a lot of uncertainty, I've spent most of my time in the healthcare space, and everybody's, wringing their hands over what's going to happen with Obamacare and the cost of drugs going up. At the same time, there's all kinds of new technologies that are being created to address those problems, and smart entrepreneurs are going to figure out solutions to those problems. And so I'm very optimistic, actually, about the future and the changes that are coming on. The big trends, the things that are kind of catching everybody's imagination I referred to earlier in the incredible explosion of knowledge that's happened in the molecular biology area, understanding the fundamental aspects of disease and being able to target therapies in a way that was just not even conceivable 25 years ago. That's gotten a start in cancer. I think it's going to go. It's got so much potential to go, not only in broadening what's happening in cancer, but taking initial steps that are making a big difference to making even bigger steps. And I think you're going to see it happening in areas like neurology, where we've really had so little advancement. Alzheimer's is a terrible disease. These fundamental understandings are going to enable whole new approaches that are going to be pretty exciting to watch unfold.
Thank you. Scott?
Well, I certainly agree that in the life sciences, we've been investing in life sciences for 40 years now, and I've been watching. I'm not a participant, but I've been watching for 21 of those years, and what we see coming along in the last 5 to 7 years is so different than what we saw, for me anyway, in the prior years. So I think that's really, really exciting. I think we're going to be, I expect us to see cures to major disease states and things of that nature, which I never imagined possible. But likewise, on the IT side of the house, which is information technology, the other side of what we do, I think we're going to see more change than we've ever seen before. The shift, the architectural shift to the cloud plus mobile devices essentially obsoletes all the traditional IT technologies. So if you just think of the stack of stuff from the hardware up, operating systems, databases, web architectures, security, you can think of the whole list. Development tools, you name it. Everything is up for grabs because, all of the things that came before were designed for a different architecture, and the needs are just different. I mean, we have 3 companies in our portfolio alone that are developing new kinds of databases. There hasn't been any exciting innovation in databases since the 1980s. And if you just look at the leading companies, we have sort of 7 defined layers of the stack. The leading 7 companies are worth over $1 trillion. So there's going to be, those guys are all sitting ducks. And I doubt more than 1 or 2 of them will survive. It's the normal trend when you have big architectural shift. In addition to that, we've just had 15 or so years of the development of everything online. And there's a tool set that's been developed for not only distributing things online, but marketing to people online, and a bunch of new logistical capabilities. Every part of building an offline business, for the most part, has been innovated with some online business. And those tools and technologies are available now to disrupt virtually any other industry. My favorite example of this is a company in our portfolio called Casper. Some of you may know this company. They make mattresses. So you can imagine how puzzled I was when 4 years ago these 3 Stanford engineers came to us and they said they had a better mattress. And the first thought I had to myself was, are we really here to talk about funding a mattress company? Nevertheless, we gave them $5 million. And a year later, that was their Series A financing. A year later, they came back. Oh, these guys are back. Well, they obviously want more money. Let's see what they have to say. And they stood up and they said, well, in the last little over 12 months, we've gone from 0 to $100 million in revenue.
Huh.
At which point they had my attention. And then they blew my mind. They said, and we're profitable. So you remember what Jeff Immelt said about, it's not just about making something new, you got to figure out how to make money? On $5 million, this is, for anybody who's ever invented a new physical product, going from 0 to $100 million and being profitable doesn't compute. And it literally started me thinking about this thesis that I have, that the physics of starting and building businesses have changed. And I'm not going to derail this conversation to take you through that thesis, but I think we're going to see these online tools and technologies applied to every industry. And one outcome of the research I've already done is that in our little portfolio of 450 companies, we're disrupting 36 different industries outside of technology. And I already told you that all of technology is being disrupted. So we're going to see a tremendous amount of disruption. I do fear that we're going to go from being the white hats to being the black hats. And what I mean by that is most people think of all of us innovators in Silicon Valley and elsewhere as doing good things for the world. And we are going to do a lot of good things for the world. But we are going to upset a lot of jobs in the process. So I'll just give you an example of one company that I think will disrupt a lot of jobs. I happen to be involved in the company. It's called Robinhood. How many of you know about Robinhood? So no one over the age of 35 knows about Robinhood. That's sort of by design. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Almost no one. Well, why is that? They have a mobile-first company which allows you to open an account with any amount of money and trade stocks for free. So they have taken, the discount brokerage business to its logical conclusion, which is free. And free is the best and most disruptive business model ever invented. Because if you offer something of tremendous value, and it costs you very little to deliver to your customers, then you can take over the market, disrupt all the incumbents, and then figure out something else that you can do for your customers for which they will pay you and make a business out of it. So that's what Robinhood's doing. The company is growing enormously fast. But the reason I brought it up is I was in Manhattan the other day, and I'm looking around, I'm thinking, what do all these people do in these tall businesses, in these huge skyscrapers? A lot of these people who make a fairly decent living work for companies that are somehow associated with the securities business. Well, when stock trading goes to zero, a lot of those people are going to be disrupted. And I can't reveal too much about Robinhood other than to say that their operating costs are a very small fraction of the incumbents because they do everything in software. They are managing trillions of dollars with less than 100 people. That's a wonderful thing for their customers. There are a lot of people employed in the securities business who will not be employed in 10 years. It's that simple. So I think there's going to be good and bad.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting comment. We may get to that in some of the general discussion, and it's something, again, we as technology developers and educators think about a lot, the tremendous power of technology to bring about disruptive change, but the effects it have are certainly not uniform, and it can disrupt many people's lives very significantly in ways that they would perceive to be not entirely positive. So, Karl and Andrea, let me turn to each of you with a short question, and then we'll open it up. And Karl, I'm going to start with you, simply thinking about a faculty member we're hiring today and thinking about your experience such as it is so far. What recommendations would you have for a new faculty member thinking about being an entrepreneur? Okay.
I maybe to start with know thyself. So I think that entrepreneurship is a very individual thing. And I think that different people will take different pathways towards being successful in entrepreneurship. So I don't know that there's a cookie cutter formula that you could give a young faculty member. I think, from my perspective, as I alluded to earlier, I think being sure that you're focused on your mission as an academic and a faculty member early on is really important. There's a job to be done as a faculty member, and I think you have to be very careful that doesn't get compromised. But I think that once you establish yourself and kind of you're comfortable wearing that academic hat, one of the wonderful things about Dartmouth, and in particular about Thayer, is that there is this freedom and flexibility and in fact even kind of active encouragement on the part of the administration and just the community here that opens up the doors of possibilities in entrepreneurship for faculty members. And so I think maybe my words of advice is that this is an exciting time and it's an exciting place to be, and that there's lots of opportunities.
Well, thank you. And I will point out and note for the record, I really like the fact that your initial reaction when I asked that question was to take a deep breath and exhale. So that pause is important, and I may end up sending all the young faculty who asked that question to you, because I think just saying, whoa, okay, let's talk about this seriously before you leap into this adventure is an inappropriate thing to do. Andrea, I want to ask you the same question, but from your perspective, not thinking of it as a student, but as a fairly recent graduate and a young professional, right? If a current MEM or PhD student were to come to you, or an undergraduate for that matter, and say, I'm thinking of starting a company shortly after I graduate, what advice would you have?
I think community, again, is super important. So I would say trying to surround yourself with people who have done something similar to what you're trying to do. I find that some of the best advice that we get in our company as entrepreneurs is from other founders of companies, so people who have done exactly what we're trying to do, because there are a lot of people who have opinions about what you're trying to do, and you might not always want to listen to every person who gives you advice. So I would say definitely trying to find people who have successfully started companies and using them as a resource. That would be probably my main piece of advice. And also finding an ecosystem. So I think like being in certain places where there are lawyers who can help you and who know how to set up a company when you're starting something, or just other resources like accelerators, incubators sometimes are helpful for people. So seeking out those resources that are going to empower you and connect you with other people in the community.
Thank you. So thanks all of you for thoughtful comments on a range of questions related to entrepreneurship and the entrepreneurial ecosystem. Let me open it up to our group of alums and friends and visitors who are here today and see if there are questions you might have for any one of our panelists. So, right here.
Both Scott and Sherri spoke about talking to the first-time entrepreneur and what qualities you're looking for. What about that third-time entrepreneur who probably didn't quite, make millions of dollars on their first couple of ventures? What are you looking for in that person for their background to decide to fund them?
Want to go first?
Sure. Well, again, Jeff Immelt, I think, said it well. They like people who have made mistakes but not repeated them. So we look for people who have actually gained from whatever it is they've done before. I mean, it's practically Silicon Valley legend that everybody's had a failure along the way. So we don't view that as something more than part of the cost of education. I think we all know that we learn more from our failures than our successes because they haunt us in the night and we think about everything we might have done differently, and we've all had a lot of them. So it's definitely not a black mark.
Sherri?
Yeah, I think we actually have a culture in our country, a culture against older people we don't think of them as entrepreneurs. But I've actually given this a lot of thought, and I don't think age is the issue. I think what's more important is what's great about young people is they don't know a lot, and they don't know what they don't know, and so they're not afraid. And what happens when you get older is you tend to sort of think, well, I have this area of expertise and I'm going to build on that. But then you have all these demons because you know all the things that you failed around that, and that takes away a little of the edge that you need when you're an entrepreneur. So I think it's the same qualities that are required in both older entrepreneurs and younger entrepreneurs. You need to be in a space that you're really excited about, that you don't know so much about that you've got demons, but that if you don't know a lot, you do what the young entrepreneurs do and surround yourself with people who know what they're doing so that that passion and the instincts come through, but the demons don't get you.
Thank you. Other questions? So, yeah.
So picking up on Andrea's point about really be helpful to have an ecosystem. Does Dartmouth College have the right ecosystem for entrepreneurs? And if not, what would you recommend to improve the ecosystem about?
I'll talk about that one.
Sure.
So when I was starting my company, Dartmouth did not have a formalized ecosystem at all. But Dartmouth has a 200-year history of being fanatical supporters of each other. And so when I was starting my company, I had sort of on the technical side, I had Bob Langer and his network and community. But I had the Dartmouth community helping me too. And every time I needed to learn something, I would figure out somebody in the Dartmouth ecosystem that I could go to. And you know, our first animal experiment was done by a guy who went to Geisel, who was at MGH. He was a Geisel grad. Our first round of financing came from Terry McGuire, who's a Thayer grad. Our business plan was put together with the help of 2 Dartmouth alums that were Bain partners. Our board of directors had so many people from Dartmouth on the board, none of whom I knew when I was here, that the one guy from Princeton called himself the minority recruit. And Business Week magazine ended up profiling us as an extreme example of alumni loyalty when they do the rankings, and Dartmouth always comes in number 1. So I tell that story because don't hesitate to just reach out to people. I have found that I didn't know any of these people. I just called them up and I told them what I was doing and I said I need help, and they all helped. So now that Dartmouth is actually taking entrepreneurship really seriously, and it's one of 3 pillars that our president is promoting, and we've got Thayer with 1/3 of the faculty doing entrepreneurial things. You know, this is an ecosystem that's even more conducive than it was when I was starting my company, and I think it's going to, we've only seen the beginning. I think it's going to be very exciting to see how much better it gets over time.
Thank you.
What would you recommend if you could offer some suggestions for the direction you think would be helpful?
So I think the direction that would be helpful is to figure out a way to get the diversity of thought together, to break down the silos, get the undergrads, the graduate students working together, getting the arts and the engineers, which they already do a good job. I mean, I think there's more double majors here in art and engineering than any other double major. But all of those, mixing up the disciplines, mixing up the people, mixing up the backgrounds, that's, I think, we know we need to do it, but we haven't done it yet.
Thank you. Karen?
So I will try to frame this correctly, but I think about, as our mission is serve using engineering to serve a public good and help society. While I certainly appreciate the message that I got in the mail, I'm not sure that is saving the world as I like to think about it. With low carbon future that I hope to get to, a lot of the challenges don't necessarily fit into a framework that I can make a profit in 10 years. Or, how do we think about or reframe entrepreneurial approaches or a way to commercialize things that don't fit in that model, and how do we sort of blend those two? Specifically to biofuels.
Specifically to what?
Specifically to who?
To
Sorry.
biofuels. Okay, so Kara's
I
a
see.
PhD graduate, and she has a particular technical expertise and interest that may have come through in that question.
So I could talk a little bit about this because I'm now working with the Gates Foundation on, so I spent my whole career working in biotech, which is an area where, the history of biotech has been you fund a company for over a decade. of losing hundreds of millions of dollars because the profit is at the end. So that's, one way is if it's just going to take a lot of money before you get the profit. If it's a really big profit, you can find people that will fund that. The other is if you have a really big idea that could really change the world and it's not going to make any money, there are people that will fund that because it's a really big idea. So
There's a reason I let you answer the question.
it's not him. There are others.
Thank you, Kara, for that question. Others, there were a few hands over here, so how about Z? Scott, why don't you take that one? PhD versus non, and do faculty look different than the rest of the universe? Be careful how you answer that.
Well, the first thing is I don't have any data for you on the degrees that lead to the greatest entrepreneurial success, but I do have data on the degrees that lead to the greatest success as a venture capitalist, and perhaps to your surprise, that's a PhD. So more than MBAs, for example. But I think the broader question is about whether PhDs are necessary or more likely to be successful in an entrepreneurial venture. I think it depends a lot on the nature of the venture and the nature of the innovation. And there's a continuum from what I'll think of as an incredible technical breakthrough of some kind, where if you haven't pursued some strain of knowledge to the nth degree to become the world expert who figures out the next insight that leads to that breakthrough, you're probably not going to be the entrepreneur to start the company and be successful. And you probably got a PhD somewhere on that path to something at the other end of the spectrum, which is a business model, innovation that requires no technical understanding of any kind. And there are, tremendous companies at every point along the continuum. You don't need a PhD to start Airbnb or Uber, as an example, on that end of the continuum. And you absolutely need a PhD to start a biotech company or many other significantly technical challenges.
Thank you. There are a few hands up. So here in the back.
So you said 20% of entrepreneurs are dyslexic?
40%.
I'm dyslexic.
You're dyslexic too?
50%
And half the
of
panel, 50% of the panel here today. What did you say your problem is?
40.
You had a question, right?
All right, gentlemen.
Three characteristics of a dyslexic that give them an advantage in a situation where they are taking on roles as entrepreneurs.
Well, I think...
It doesn't have to be 3, it could be 5, it could be 0.
Well, I think the simplest way to think about the difference of the dyslexic brain architecture is that it doesn't have a lot of special purpose functions that can be very quick at doing simple things. That's what the regular brain architecture does so well. So the dyslexic can't do simple arithmetic at anywhere near the rate of a non-dyslexic person. But the dyslexic brain tends to use all of its functions to do anything, which is why it's slow at doing simple things. But conversely, it can usually see the big picture and solve complex problems more quickly. That's the simplest way to describe it.
Yeah. So we have just a few minutes left. I will take one last question. The panel will remain for a few minutes in the beginning, at the end, if you'd like to approach them individually. And then I will remind everyone that our goal is to take a community picture after this at 2:45, which will be in the Great Hall. So with that, our final question.
Anything
That's a really interesting question. I'm looking around to see if Chris Hu, a board member who's an IP attorney, is still in the audience, but we will turn to our panel. Would any of you like to take
I would be very happy to take that one. There's actually quite a bit of debate within the entrepreneurial community about the importance of patents for fostering innovation. I happen to come out with the belief, having been very involved in this debate in Washington over the last 5 or 6 years, that patents are an essential ingredient for a significant number of kinds of innovations. There are other kinds of innovations where they are not necessary or in some cases even detrimental. And the continuum would be from very things, biotech would probably be the most extreme case, where you have to invest huge amounts of time and energy to produce an idea that could be very easily duplicated, versus, say, software or internet businesses where you can often with very little capital generate tremendous network effects on very small amounts of innovation. So that's the continuum. And the people who live over on this side tend to want to get rid of the patent system, and actually the largest companies, Google, Microsoft, Cisco, are very actively working to destroy the patent system in America. I can tell you this with great certainty. And the people on the other end of the spectrum are trying to protect it. But it has been diminished quite a lot over the last 12 or 15 years. I'll actually be going to the White House on Wednesday to try to convince the new administration of my point of view.
Thank you.
Of course, so much more of the world doesn't care whether it's patented because they get a hold of the data.
Oh, there's plenty of people who are happy to steal ideas. That's not a new phenomenon. It's just easier to do than ever.
Thank you for your questions. Please join me in thanking our panelists for providing our discussion. Just as a closing comment, I would say, reflecting on the questions and the discussion, certainly many challenges in the system globally and nationally confront us. This is not an easy pathway for anyone to contemplate, but at its core, the opportunity for our faculty, students, and staff to think about using the system to have their ideas impact the most widest range of lives to really improve the human condition is something that I think is really motivating for engineering students that we celebrate here. And we're glad to have these individuals from our alumni community and our faculty pursuing their passion to try and make it all possible. Thank you all for joining us. We will convene in the Great Hall in, as I said, about 10 minutes. Is that right, Jen? For a community photo. I hope you'll stay for that. Then I understand there is ice cream somewhere after. Sorry, not ice cream, gelato in the atrium. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.